Hi, everyone. I'm Regan Morris. I'm with BBC News, and I was here last year at this, and I've met them all now. This is the cutting edge of the industry, the cellular ag entrepreneurs, and I know so many of you want to hear from them. And I've even had the honor of tasting some of this futuristic meat thanks to Josh at Just. I had the chicken, and it was delicious. Tasted like chicken. So,
That's all we're hoping for.
Yeah.
Nothing else.
Thank you. So to start, I'd like to ask you all rapidly what time frame you think. We all want to know when we can get cell-based meat on the market. When is it going to be? Is it this year? Is it 10 years? So if you could go down the line.
As soon as possible.
Oh, Uma.
Look, we started this industry about 3 years ago, and to think about how much has happened since 2016 of launching this industry to this room being full with entrepreneurs and incumbents to come together, there's a key innovation happening here that we want to be able to get on the market in a safe and predictable way. So working with reg agencies is the number one thing. Announcing something before we have a clear pathway, I don't think is the right approach in my mind. We will make an announcement pretty soon, and when that is, but we are ready to come to market pretty quickly here. But it's not 10 years like you started off with.
Okay, Josh?
I think it's likely to be this year, but it's important to define what on the market means, right? It's not on the market in 4,000 Walmarts. It's not on the market in all of McDonald's, but on the market in a handful of restaurants. And we were talking earlier, Regan, I think the key limiting step to that isn't the technology, it's regulatory. And as Uma said, it's really important that we get that right. We don't just want to ship it out and ask people to buy it. We got to make sure that we're thoughtful and mature about how we handle it. It's got to be labeled properly. We need to make sure the regulators understand the process. But I think it's more likely than not going to be this year. I think almost certainly next year. But the bigger question is, when is this going to be the thing, not just launch? That's going to take a little bit of time, but we get the cost down and get the taste up. I think very likely in the near future, this is the meat, and there's very unlikely to be another option.
All right, Michael?
It's interesting to hear. I mean, we talk to many of the entrepreneurs in the space, and from this year, Josh, to maybe 8-10 years out. So we hear everything, and probably future will tell. It's really me not being a science person. Everything can happen, but it would be great if you go this year.
Is that a this year prediction?
How much do you need to bet on that forecast? Yeah, it would be nice.
Okay, can anyone hear me? No? Having technical difficulties.
Try again.
Hello?
Oh, yeah.
That okay? Yeah, so I think most of the companies have prototypes and have products that they've tasted internally or externally, so it's not about when can anybody eat this, and it's definitely contingent on the regulatory pathway, as Uma and Josh mentioned. I think the question is, what do you want to put out at what cost, right? So for us anyway at Fork and Good, we definitely want to be doing more internal R&D to bring the cost down to closer to where meat is. And then we have to actually engineer the scale up of that bioprocess. And that's still, for us, at least 2 or 3 years away.
I think we also must remember that there's a variety of different products. So for minced meats, the time frame is shorter than for 3D complex tissues like steaks or chicken breasts. So that would be further down the line. So it's a question of which products. The minced meats will get to market way sooner than the complex tissues.
And I wanted to ask, but there's so many hurdles you just mentioned, regulations, technology. What are the biggest hurdles for the business? Do you want to start with that one? Yeah, I know you're in stealth mode, so I don't know as much about yours, but Fork and Good. But maybe you could talk about what the biggest challenges are.
Yeah, sure. I won't talk about our specific technology, but I can definitely talk as an industry overall as well as us. And I would start with something that I really saw earlier in the technical panel too, which is we're doing something really hard. right? This is not software. Like, this is not moving fast and breaking things. This is moving smartly and building things, and we're building with a very, very critical eye to safety. And what we're building is an entirely new production system for meat. And that's, I mean, it's inspiring, it's crazy, but it's a really audacious goal. And with biological research, if you innovate in one area, there are 5 other doors of inquiry that open, and then you have to address those. So I think as an industry, we're finally making progress on the science. The next step is really making progress on the engineering challenges. And so to me, those are some of the main challenges that we're facing today. I won't get into all the technical detail. I'm sure those questions will come up on their own. And then the second is really like what's been mentioned, regulatory. And on that end, I think we've made tremendous progress in the US. We just launched the Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation. Memphis and Just are also part of said alliance, as well as Blue Nalu and Finless, who are both seafood companies. And this alliance is a really incredible stepping stone to having a joint voice for the industry to interact with the regulators, to interact with FDA and USDA, and start the process of getting that regulatory pathway in place. So the alliance launched, I think, last week, and we're hoping even this year to really get the process for putting that pathway in place.
And that's mainly to lobby the USDA and the FDA to move more quickly? Is that, or to?
It's not necessarily a lobbying thing. I think any regulator just needs to have a sense of what are the core process points of the industry? What are the generally held beliefs about risks and hazards? Like, we need to articulate that, not like company by company, but as an industry.
To speak with one voice.
Yeah, like literally just educate, right? And that's been missing up until now. And so it's a point to have a neutral industry-wide conversation about what we're doing so that they can move forward.
I think that I would add 2 more things to that. One is the biggest thing that's happening in this industry is in the last 3 years, there's been incredible interest and validation of a global demand for improving meat production. This industry, cell-based meat, did not exist 3 years ago. It was science fiction back in 2015 when Memphis launched in late 2015 and started talking about it and did the public demonstration in January 2016. By the way, that's also the day that GFI launched, so big congratulations to GFI for bringing everybody together. So when we launched the beef meatball, that was just kind of the opening shot, but we didn't have the ability to predict this much interest would pick up. We had an instinct, but one of the things that is, to me, a glaring gap between now and getting on market in a meaningful way is the investment gap in the field. If you think about everybody sitting here together, focused on cell-based meat, maybe close to $100 million has been raised, and we're thinking about an industry that is $2 trillion. So we do have to have incredibly large amounts of capital come into this to accelerate the work that's being done. And there's a lot of science that's already been done for this field. And we need to be able to translate that into applications for scaling and engineering, and that requires capital. So I see an investment gap. I also see an awareness and education gap where what this field needs is open versus stealth. We want a lot of companies to come out there and talk about what they're doing openly, because that's the way you get education, awareness among everyone, including regulators, policymakers, investors, media, and general public who really want to hear about it. So I would strongly discourage, stealth mode in this field. The second thing is to really embrace and not or. Can't go and give a message that I'm going to come and disrupt all of you guys. When you think about scale of meat, it's 750 billion pounds. So, and not or is a message that I think we all have to embrace and be able to articulate that really well. And then the last thing I would just start off here is there's an incredible demand gap. We have 750 billion pounds of meat being made right now using 70 billion animals. And if that demand is doubling, we're talking about either going to 140 billion animals, which I don't think there's resources for, or filling that demand gap with production techniques that can scale for the next 1,000 years. So when I think about plant-based options that are coming, when I think about cell-based meat, there's an incredible ribbon of demand that we can take and take the stress of the existing system. And that's the message we have to lean into the incumbent industry, because they can get behind it. And it's a very big tent kind of message that we strongly believe in. We live and breathe that at Memphis. And it's important that we all come together. And AMPS that you talked about, Nia, it's a really important moment for the industry. Last week, when Alliance for Meat, Poultry, Seafood Association was launched, to make that happen this early on, the entire intent was to educate policymakers and bring awareness. And that's going to benefit everybody in this room. So there's really nothing to be holding back. We've got an incredibly desirable industry, an incredible story that people want to hear. We should tell that really proudly. There's really nothing to hide in this, because the transparent way of production and the product that people can get behind, and when they taste it, and you said you tasted the product, those are incredibly magical moments that people should really go and run after. So that's where we're really thinking about the gaps this industry has.
Maybe I would add one thing to this. It's not only about regulation. When you talk about acceptance and going out there and the incumbents in the space, I think it's a lot about communication, proactive communication, to prepare, the future consumer. We don't know when we are in the market, but getting this thing right and get already today the right messaging into the market that future consumers get this right and not scared. And this is science fiction meat. What is this? So the earlier we can get together on there, and I think there's a good initiative already by the GFI supported you, I think, Uma with Memphis supported this thing, that get the right messaging out early on, I think will be important, because communication is a big challenge.
But to echo what the panelists have said, it is very much about scale. Right? We can make this in a lab, we can make this in smaller pilot plants. At the end of the day, if we're really going to solve the problem, we need to be making hundreds of millions of pounds of this in facilities all over the planet at extremely low cost, right? That is incredibly challenging. That is going to require a lot of capital. It's going to require a lot of understanding on how you translate what we see in a lab and a pilot plant into a larger commercial environment. And we saw the same thing with the other work that we do with Just Egg. We could scramble something in the lab a few years ago, yet it took 2 years to figure out a way to take the scramble in a lab and actually put it on the shelves of a retailer. That translation challenge is a really important one, and it's going to be the biggest, one of the biggest things that we need to pay attention to make this happen.
And Uma, you mentioned the investment gap. We have an investor with us, Michael, if there's entrepreneurs out there. So I'm sure lots of you would like to see more government investment and whatnot, but since we have an investor here with us, what, Michael, are you looking for if you're going to invest in a company in this field? What do you want to see? What do you want to know?
How many entrepreneurs are in the room? Fingers up.
It's hard to see.
That view. Investors? Okay, it's almost equal. There's some general stuff every investor probably is looking at, especially when it's venture and at these stages, which is market size, addressable market, regulatory issues, uniqueness of the business, long-term sustainability of the business. And then, since it's all early stage, there's no revenue, there's really very difficult for us to analyze something. What we typically, number crunching stuff is not possible here. So it's a strong reliance on the team, on the founding team. Do they know each other? How have they worked together in the past? So that's the very general thing which applies to this space as well. I've been doing tech for more than 20 years, and it's the same. With all due respect, it's obviously a different industry. And then when it comes to cultivated meat, as we now apparently naming the thing, it is. We'd like to see as much proof points as possible, depending on the stage where the company is, on I think the 4 major building blocks in this space, which is cell lines, media cost, scaffolding, and then as Josh just mentioned, the big question about scale up and the related cost to it. So the more decent R&D planning, the more proof of concepts we get, the more we can see. The more confident and we are really, very biased investors. We love the space, so that's the only thing we do. But as Uma said, there is obviously a massive gap of funding, especially when we talk about the next step. So if we want to get the next type of investor onto this board and leave a little bit the incest here on the GFI, then we have to work on these areas and get as many proof points as possible, and then we hopefully can attract the next level of investors, bigger funds, growth funds, some of the probably traditional venture guys will join today. I think it's very sporadic. I mean, you have one, Uma, in your cap table, which is, I think it's the first and only investment in the space. Yeah, John, I met him yesterday from DFJ. They haven't been doing anything else. And these guys, obviously, they have the big pockets. They should join our race.
There's been so much positive news in the plant-based market. There's been, Beyond Meat's IPO showed, if nothing else, what a massive appetite there is from the investor community. And how does that affect your business? Does it, if nothing else, I imagine it helps you attract more investment, or am I wrong?
I mean, it's fantastic for the field. Plant-based options have been improving their taste at a rapid pace. And the awareness of how food comes to the table is, for the first time, real. If cell-based meat was here 10 years ago, I don't think it would have had a chance. But now is the time, because there's a lot of trends. There's a very aware consumer who wants to know where the food is coming from. There's a lot of discernment and taste. And as companies are coming out with products that people can get behind and identify with, it just is an incredible opportunity that is just very well set for us to take advantage of, which is why I talk about being open and not being a stealth mode and lean in. Look, the product we're making is meat. There's never been in the history of humanity meat coming to the table, directly grown from animal cells. Everything else we're talking about that's creating this excitement, clearly it's tasty, but it's a meat alternative or a meat substitute. But when we're talking about cell-based meat, beef, chicken, cow, duck, tuna, I mean, these are things that people have loved for thousands of years. And I think that's why the field should be really proud and talk about it. And the investment gap will be solved by a few people who recognize the opportunity available in this market. And if you think about the internet, Michael and I were talking about it before we came on stage. In the 1994-95, it just felt like the same. There was not anybody who knew about the internet. But the initial capital that came in accelerated 2 to 3 to 4 companies, or maybe 5, and they just set the stage for everybody else. And I see an ecosystem building in the next 5-10 years that is massive to take advantage of. So there are some forward-leaning investors who've been looking at it at the venture stage and growth stage and beyond. And I think the timing is ripe for them to recognize the opportunity with cell-based. And the fundamental thing it comes down to is choice. And when I talk about choice, I give an anecdote. As practicing cardiology, I've had patients come who've literally had heart attacks, cardiac arrests, and had been dead and declared dead on the field, that were resuscitated on the table, opened their arteries, and I would tell them, I've stented every single artery in your heart. There's no other place to stent. You've got a full metal jacket in your heart. Don't smoke, watch your diet. What I found very surprising was, 30 days or so, a third of those patients who died on the field would come back, they're back on smoking, and they're back to poor dietary habits. So what does it tell you? It tells me that choice is so much more important than their own life. And when we're talking about humanity who's been eating meat for thousands of years, and we're saying, we want to preserve the choice of you eating meat. Here's a way we can do that. I think the opportunity is so large, people have to see proof, which is why we talk about at Memphis, every single time we have a major announcement to make, we make it. We invite people to come and see the products. We do public tastings. We invite the reporters to come in. And that's really to establish the field. And I think every single one in this room is going to be doing that and establishing the ecosystem. And globally, it's going to be only successful if we can do this. If we try to be in our own silos, it's not going to work. And I think another concept to keep in mind for all of us is collaboration does not preclude competition. We can still compete fiercely in the marketplace, but collaboration on certain things is really helpful to accelerate the field.
Yeah, Regan, the more companies are out there succeeding, the better it is for all of us. People should be competing against every single person here on stage. People should attempt to find another sort of plant that scrambles. Competition is really important. If we were all serious about creating a better food system, we should all be of the understanding that it's not just about us, right? If that's really what we're doing, that's the way it is. And as Uma said, the more and more consumers are aware, the more they realize that there are issues with the food system, the more they realize the conventional thing isn't the only thing that's out there, the more they realize in the future they can actually have animal-based meat without killing an animal, ultimately at a lower cost, the more we're going to transform things.
Nia, do you want to talk about about that? Do you want
Add to that? Yeah, sure. So I think Uma touched on investors are excited. I mean, I think the Beyond Meat IPO has been one of the only food tech IPOs that there's such a small handful that I think that's inspiring. So that's certainly true. But I think the advent of the explosion of the plant-based meat space has really ignited people's imagination, like food technologists, chefs, eaters, like people are just really, really excited that something new is happening and there are new ingredients. I mean, when was the last time you heard of a new food ingredient that didn't just terrify you, right? So this is something that you're actually excited about. So when I get excited about cell-based meat is not only as a substitute, but it's just a pure form of animal protein that doesn't have to have a really messy, scary ingredient list, and it can be put in whatever format, and it's a brand new, nutritious ingredient. And that completely blows up the space for food innovation. And I think we're going to see such exciting things. They might be plant-based, they might be cultivated meat, they might be a blend of plant and cell-based, and that's exciting, And as long as we're collaborating on especially the critical things of safety, I mean, as just a foodie, I'm really excited about what I'm going to be eating.
What I've noticed regarding this, the whole excitement around Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and these types of alternatives is that people have really shifted the conversation from we need to substitute the meat industry completely to now we need to find a different way to create meat, whether we're creating meat from plants in the cases of Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods, or we're creating meat from animal cells. But people and investors are acknowledging that meat is a product that people love to eat, and it's probably here to stay. But at the same time, the way it is produced is too taxing on the environment, people's health, the animals, et cetera, and we need to find a way to approach that. And that is something that is very exciting to see because it brings a lot of very positive attention to the cultivated meat sphere.
Maybe one additional comment without repeating the famous Beyond IPO of Beyond, but what happened there is that it took the topic to a much more general public. I mean, we were fundraising for the venture capital fund, and it's amazing to see that suddenly you get inbound interest from people. I mean, they even ask you what you do, but they kind of suddenly feel that something's going on, and there's a proof point that suddenly the first vegan company, as they call it, they go public, and on top they have this stellar performance. So that clearly helped raise awareness and probably is pouring in more capital as we speak into the space, which is obviously great for everyone here.
And of all the good news, you can get vegan options. It's changed the driving road trip experience in the United States anyway, being able to get vegan food at Burger King and Del Taco, and for a lot of people. But with all the positive news, there's these lawsuits as well that will have the plant-based Tofurkeys and Good Food Institute are fighting these battles for you, really, because it will affect your products. How important, Shir, do you want to start? How important is it that your product is called meat, and what do you do if legally you're not allowed to?
It's not only important, it's what it is. It's not me saying that I want to call it meat. It is meat, case in point. Now, obviously, it's something that might be a little controversial to some people, but I believe that eventually, slowly and gradually, we will gravitate more and more towards calling it cultivated meat, cell-based meat, whatever have you. We will gravitate more towards just calling it meat because it is meat, just like you don't go out of your way to say this is a hydroponic lettuce. You say, I ate lettuce today. It's going to be the same thing, I believe, eventually.
The rest of you, anyone want to chime in on that?
I mean, I completely agree. I go back to that little kids game, which is just animal, mineral, plant, and what we're producing is animal, right? So to say not meat, I think, would be anything other than meat would kind of be misleading, actually, and not the truth. But I think it does point, like, that's kind of avoiding the question a little bit. I would take a step back and say, well, what's driving the pushback on labeling? And it's something that we do have to address, and that's a feeling of threat or fear amongst traditional producers. And that's where we need to really broaden the conversation and have it be an inclusive conversation. Just to underscore something Uma mentioned, like, it has to be a yes and. Like, these are all complementary products. We've already seen that plant-based meat consumption actually is increasing. Sometimes those same consumers' regular meat consumption. And I think we're going to need all of these solutions to meet the animal protein need regardless. Like, I don't see a world where we don't have one of these legs. And so we need to have that big tent and loop people in and explain why this isn't the threat that it may seem.
I don't think this happens at the scale that is required if it's not called meat either. I mean, we all should remember every day, food is not a science project. Food is story, it is identity, it is culture, it is what our grandma's cooking tasted like when we were 4 years old, right? That's food. It's different than software. It's different than an electric car. And meat for so many people, including me, growing up in Alabama, means a lot of that stuff, right? And so a name is about identity. It's more than just the molecular makeup of what it is. It's about identity. And I agree, just like your lettuce example, in the future, no one's going to call an electric car a car. I don't call my smartphone a smartphone anymore. I call it a phone. Mm-hmm. In due time, as it gets more ubiquitous, it's not going to be called cultured or cell-based or animal-based that doesn't require killing an animal. It's just going to be called meat because that's what it is.
All right.
I would highlight the human experience portion of it. I can tell after doing hundreds of tastings of various products, beef, chicken, or duck, I can tell you the magical moment really happens when a well-calibrated meat eater comes and tastes meat, cell-based meat. You don't have to talk about anything else. That human experience of this is meat, they immediately recognize this as meat. That's the first layer. And I think the more opportunities we give to demystify it and put it in front of a consumer, it'll speak for itself because there is nothing to mask. You're producing the muscle, you're producing the fat, you're producing the connective tissues, and you're cooking it just like you've always cooked meat. So that experience, I think we can't put it in words, we can't really put it in marketing. That experience happens in front of a consumer when they taste. So I'd say that's the overarching one. And the second one, of course, is the tactical things that it is meat. What else can you call it? Especially if you are allergic to some things in meat and you call it something else, you're going to be in deep trouble by misleading a consumer. So we want to be able to make sure that we're putting safe products on the market, not misleading a consumer. And if you're eating animal protein, you've got to call it animal protein.
Here's one from the audience for you, Uma. Are the pictures on Memphis Meat's Instagram real cell-based meat?
I haven't seen every single picture, but I have to say if there's someone on a media team, they can certainly talk about it. My sense is yes. All the pictures we put on there in general are our pictures, but if someone is putting something else, I'm not 100% sure, but majority are ours.
And here is another one. Uma says cell-based, Josh says cultured. Both seem science-y. Is there a reason not to use the consumer-friendlier clean meat?
Maybe I'll start with that. So I really dislike cell-based meat. I think it sounds way too sciencey, and the folks that I grew up with in Alabama explicitly would avoid it, even if it tasted good. I also don't like cultured meat that much, but I think it sounds a little bit better, and also I think truthfully reflects what the process is. I know GFI has done a wonderful job recently of doing some research around a term cultivated, which I think I slightly prefer to cultured. My favorite now is animal-based meat, but then unfortunately I have to say right after it, without killing the animal. It's a hard thing what the hell we call this, right? But I do think whatever it ends up being, and hopefully it's meat, we've got to remember that the folks in this conference are not the folks we're selling to. The folks in labs are not the folks we're selling to. We're trying to appeal to billions of consumers out there who are not thinking about tissue engineering and media. They're just trying to enjoy a good dinner with their family, and it's got to be named something that is honest about the process and also resonates with them.
I'm just going to weigh in on this as well, because I think what you want to talk to a consumer is on level with you. In general, I think the more factual, the more truthful, the more inclusive, and more clear and direct you are, then you're talking to a consumer on a level playing field. And when we talk about cell-based, you're literally you're demystifying almost everything. This is meat building up from the building blocks of what you're already eating now, which is made of cells. And it clearly talks to, okay, these are cow cells or pig cells or duck cells. Treating a consumer of the future on a level playing field with you, we believe is fundamentally so important. If we try to simplify it and demystify it and call it a very nice name, I don't think it's going to cut it. If it ends up ultimately as meat, it is real, that's great. But our philosophy has been inclusive, transparent, and educate. Therefore, to me, cell-based does it. It's like clearly talking to a consumer. Or look at what's happening with GMO right now. All the efforts were like, no one cares about it. We'll just put this out there. It's nutritive, it's that. But there's an unnecessary debate that's going on, and the consumer feels like they've not been looped in. And therefore, why do that again? We've got some experience there. And ultimately, when we start putting the product in front of people, that's really when the magic happens. And we've got to be very proud of how this is coming to the market. We have a very desirable story to tell. When we talk about meat, historically, for thousands of years, meat has been associated with an animal, right? You can only get meat by killing an animal. And we're saying we can detach that. We can bring meat to the table by working directly from animal cells. And that's a very powerful long-term message. And I see incumbents getting behind it. I see almost every culture getting behind it, because no one is out there agitating to kill an animal, but they just don't want to give up a product they deeply love. And because we're talking about fundamental humanity and nature of emotions, I think truthfulness is what's going to win in this, and that's where I am on nomenclature.
Let me ask you, don't you think you can represent the scientific truth of it without scaring the hell out of the consumer? Don't you think there's a way that you can actually do both?
I would love to, and I think if we start talking about scaring a consumer, no matter what we call it, Josh, when you're putting a product out there for the first time and saying, look, we've got meat to the plate at a different process, there's going to have to be an education process.
Sure.
The simpler it is, the better. The more direct and factual it is, the better. Ultimately, when we start getting it out on the market, we all agree it's going to be called meat, chicken, because we believe our beef is beef, our chicken is chicken. That's where it's going. So I want to simplify the path to that, as opposed to taking extra layers of getting a consumer there. And this is a good example of where we can differ on it, but ultimately we are getting to the same place of calling it meat.
And I think
the regulators is an important piece to keep in mind.
Yeah.
We can't forget how regulators are looking at this, because they are gatekeepers of products getting onto the market. And in the US, it's always been cell cultured or cultured, but for regulators, it's cell-based or cell cultured or cell grown. We need to be able to have the conversation with the regulators, because we are not on the market yet. And why increase the temperature in a room when we can have this conversation with a field that really is clear to them? And it also directly speaks to a consumer about where this is coming from. And this is where I feel very strongly, you've got to be proud of what we're doing and be able to talk about it. Yes, I agree there's a little bit of scienciness to it, but I think the consumer of now and future is okay with that.
I guess I would just say, I just think I think maybe where we do agree is what is important is ensuring that we are radically transparent of what we're doing, right? We should take the consumer through the whole process. We should be open about it. We should express things through the prism of scientific truth. That should be a filter for how we deal with regulatory issues. And at the same time, right? And at the same time, it is critically important to remember at the end of the day, people are going into Walmart and buying this, or going to restaurants and buying it. And we need to be able to think really carefully about what those folks are going to buy, realizing that they're not biochemists, they're not tissue engineers. And I just do think there's a way to do it where you're expressing the scientific truth, and you're also making it a little bit more appealing to the consumer.
This is really fantastic, because this is exactly the conversation that should happen in a domain. because this is a transparent communication happening because we care about the consumer needs to know. And ultimately, we are telling this is beef, this is chicken, this is duck, this is meat. Therefore, if you're calling it something, the prefix in front of meat, I am 100% okay. And if it ends up being cell-based, I have no problem with it. I actually feel that's easy because ultimately it'll become meat. But if it's cultured, I'm okay with that. If it's something else, I'm okay with that. But the consumer is a part of that debate now. So we as industry or company are not hiding it from the consumer. I think that's fundamentally the principle behind what I'm talking about.
Agreed. No,
so that
couldn't agree more.
it becomes and the consumer, not excluding a consumer.
By the way, let's not forget, apologies. Let's not forget that eventually the hope is that the conventional meat players will be the ones marketing it, producing it eventually. And they have the best knowledge of the final consumer, the product, what the consumer wants to know, how to advocate this to the consumer. So it might be our problem now, but eventually when we'll get to market, it's going to be the issue that will be addressed by the big players who I'm sure will do a fantastic job advocating this in the best way possible.
I mean, I will say that we may be overplaying a little bit each individual company's or even the industry's ability to set the name. And what seems sciencey now may not seem sciencey in the future. Like the term organic was slightly sciencey and slightly clinical. And now we think of it as so wholesome and so lovely, and it took years for that to happen in agriculture. And I think as long as the term is not off-putting, it's fine, right? And so I like cultivated because it is generic like organic. It can cover a very complex process that we have to be transparent about. Cell-based is great because it's incredibly neutral and it has traction with regulators. I think in our conversations with regulators, we'll continue to use that. Cultured was the original term, I think, that we started with. However,
before that was artificial, which was great.
Yeah, exactly. Let's not even talk about the times of in vitro. Yeah, so like that, the problem with cultured in a regulatory context is, you know, aquaculture and cultured butter. Like, unfortunately, there's some conflicts that exist there. But these are all neutral terms. I think as an industry, we've agreed to be transparent. Just to quickly get back to the question of why not clean. And I think the problem with clean is actually consumers don't find it so appealing. It turns out we don't want our food to be clean or sterile. Like those aren't words we like to hear in food. And then at the same time, it doesn't really say much about our process. The fact that it wasn't a cultivator or that it was part of a cell culture, it more kind of points to the other kind of meat not being clean. And that's the kind of divisive attitude that we wouldn't want to adopt as an industry.
Do you worry about unintended consequences of your industry? I have a very skeptical 11-year-old vegetarian at home, and he's not buying it. Like, what? There's still a factory. There's still we don't know what your byproducts are going to be. We don't know how much energy you're going to use, even if it's water. And I know skeptical 11-year-old environmentalists are not your target market, but
they're a pretty important one.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
I still have a carnivore and a vegan. I have a very complicated family of 4. It is, so, I mean, what will be, you know, we keep saying this is going to solve all these problems. I mean, it is still industrial once you all scale up. Anyone?
Our family, when we talk about Memphis, we have the exact same thing like you have in your home. We have hardcore meat eaters at Memphis. We've got vegetarians and we have vegans. And we intentionally have everybody under the tent because it's the conversation that needs to happen between everyone about what kinds of food do you care to eat about. And when you come to the kitchen in our company, you will see people are maybe cooking, you know, plant-based products. They're cooking, you know, Angus 80-20 chuck or something like that. And they're cooking vegetables. But all of them get incredibly excited when we start cooking Memphis meats on occasion. So we see everybody getting behind it for the same reasons where, like, your vegetarian and vegan children could get really excited about it because no one's given up anything there. But to you know, really say industrial processes, yes. When you manufacture food at industrial scale, safety is paramount. You've got to have processes that recognize the risks and process that mitigate the risks and decrease the opportunities of bad things happening. But in anything in food industry, if you look at the history of what we already have, there's a process that's been set up for it, and we've got to follow that. And my strong preference is cell-based meat, or other names, is we decrease the opportunities of contamination happening by multiple magnitudes. When we detach meat production from slaughter, you're not having contamination from skin or guts coming in. That's where 90% starts off. I think we've got to take the reduction approach and try to mitigate the risks involved as we industrialized cell-based meat. And there's already well-established processes in adjacent spaces that we need to apply for food science.
Some of the ultra long-term consequences are, we probably got a lot of folks who are vegan or vegetarian in the audience, and if you stop eating kale and spinach and apples and grapes and whole foods, and now you start eating more meat, even if it's cultivated, cultured, whatever you call it, that's not necessarily the best, right? Eventually, when this gets to a cost that's incredibly low, again, this is far in the future, it's still important to realize we don't really need anything that we're talking about here up on stage to build a better food system. It's actually a much more simple approach, and we should never forget that when we're talking about all these different technologies that can make the system better.
But I'm talking more about energy consumption. Is there that as an unintended consequence? I mean, we don't know. No one's really scaled up, at least not publicly, that you've shared with us.
I can take a stab at that. So you're right. I think because no one's processing at scale, and we haven't done a complete life cycle analysis, we don't know yet. At the same time, I think it comes down to, have you designed a more efficient process than existing industrial scale agriculture? You're taking out growing the feedstock, you're taking out transporting that, storing it in silos, having a slaughterhouse, rearing animals for years, vaccinating them, giving them antibiotics. I mean, I could go on, and you're putting it all in one cultivator near a city. In theory, that's a much simpler, cleaner supply chain where you're only growing what you need. So my first company prior to this was a hydroponic farming company, which is profitable and still running in Singapore. Same thing, like why would I put a whole bunch of high-tech equipment on a rooftop in one of the most expensive cities, real estate in the world, when I could throw a bunch of seeds in a field in Malaysia? Because it still makes sense. I cut out so much waste. I don't have to use pesticide. I harvest exactly what I need, where I need it. I control and trace where the product is. It's fresher. I can actually tailor the nutrient system to influence the nutrition and the flavor. And it works, right? So I think we don't know yet, but I think we are building that analogous system. And that's partly why price is so important. So I put on my agriculture hat and think about feed conversion. If we are basically gaining biomass with a given input of feedstock, similar or more efficiently to animal agriculture, then we've made huge advances.
And you will probably see innovation around scale-up, industrialization, as you see in any other industry. I mean, it's early days, and we've seen more sustainable energy systems, which you'll probably see in the future. And other innovation around the building up of the system in a way. And the other thing is, if mankind really can expect tomorrow we eat everything from the local farm, maybe living in a village, this is doable, but if you live in the urban area, this is just not possible. So there has to be a compromise somewhere, right?
All right, this is another one from the audience for you, Uma. Since you're proposing startups shouldn't say stealth, everyone wants to know how your technology works. How do you get heterogeneity at scale, and what's in your media?
Yes, absolutely. This is a really great example of the big tent mentality. There are things you can fiercely compete on. One, you're going to be very clear, you're going to compete on the technology that you're working on. So when you come and collaborate, you want to be able to collaborate on things. How do you talk to the consumer? How do you talk to the regulator? How do you talk to investors? How do you talk to the general public? Those are the things that I think companies that are coming into this space should be very open about talking about. You stay in stealth mode if you want to talk about your technology, have a partnership agreement, You can have an agreement where you do maybe selective partnerships with 1 or 2 companies in the space or a platform company. That's all how business can grow. But keep in mind, if we just don't talk about anything, all it builds is a suspicion that, what are you guys up to? And that's not what we want for this industry. Ultimately, look, all of us agree that this is meat. None of us actually wants to have a prefix. Forget if it's cell-based or cultivated or cultured. None of them are necessary, right? We want to get to meat. And the more companies that come out and start talking about this openly, about some of the fundamental things that will make scale and adoption go, that's the reason why I talk about a principle of being open versus staying in the stealth mode.
And I guess I heard Ann Veneman, the former agriculture secretary, the other day talking about mistakes and things you've all done right. And I guess we're running out of time, but does anybody want to share mistakes that you've made that could inspire people here from not making the same ones and building your businesses?
There's a lot of mistakes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You share all your mistakes, I'll stay quiet.
Open,
I'm
right?
kidding.
Go ahead.
I would say one of the early mistakes we made it just is not really realizing how important that lab to larger scale commercialization translation is, right? We were strong on the upstream and on the downstream product development, but the engineering component, the process engineers, the food engineers, that was a big blind spot. That's part of the reason why we found something, and then it took us 2 or so years to figure out a way to scale it up. And that's a lot of time, that's a lot of money, and that's one of the biggest mistakes.
Anyone else?
I think as an advice, forming as many strategic partnerships as possible. We have strategic partnerships with the standard meat industry, with some players from the pharmaceutical, from the vaccine industry, that we can rely upon to not have to reinvent everything from scratch and build upon existing technologies and existing knowledge to make sure this gets to market as soon as possible. So if there's anybody out there who already knows what you want to know, you would most probably like to partner with them, work with them, and not try to reinvent everything.
And with that, I'd make a plug for any entrepreneurs out there to get connected to GFI, to get connected to New Harvest. And if you're interested in joining the alliance for the rest with the other cultivated, cell-based, cultured meat companies, that is why we're called Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation, by the way. Just come, have the conversation, chat, reach out. We, as an industry, because we aren't in market, it's definitely still a pre-competitive stage. We're pretty close, we're pretty tight-knit, we're pretty open. So just come and have the conversation and don't recreate our mistakes, because I think we're running out of time, but
it's gone the wrong direction. I think
we have we went over, and that's so we all have probably lists and lists of dozens of mistakes that we can help you out with. So yeah, come and talk to us.
Thank you, everybody. I think we're out of time.
Cool.